Okay, today we're going to talk about Descartes' discourse on method. We've entered the Enlightenment, and there's a lot going on in this very short book. So I'm going to give you a diagram that you can refer back to later. But for now, all right, just know that this is there so you can scroll back if you need to. Is that at all legible? Well, if not, I'll put it up at the very end of the dialogue again, or the lecture again. Okay, a couple of things you need to know. The Enlightenment is centered around a scientific revolution. And this is an advance over the scientific revolution that we got with the Greek pre-Socratics. What this new scientific age has over earlier accounts of nature is primarily two things. The first is mathematical formalization. In other words, it goes from being a rough and ready practical knowledge to an exact science. Before the mathematical formalization of physics, which is something that was that Descartes did and made important contributions to, physics was more like cookery in the sense that it was a pinch of this and a dab of that. And as Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics, it's the mark of an educated man not to demand more precision from a discipline than it can possibly offer. Well, it turns out that physics can have more precision than the ancients suspected. And that's one of the great achievements of Renaissance and later on Enlightenment science, is things get formulated mathematically, and then as a result, mathematics supersedes Latin as the common language of the learned. Okay, that's a big change. The second big change is the experimental method. The ancient tradition in physics had the idea of observation, but what it lacked was the idea of systematic observation, of keeping a control group and then testing one variable at a time, so that you could separate the difference between necessary and accidental correlations. Let me give you just one example. Someplace in the Hippocratic writings, it says, never prescribe medicine during the rising of the dog star. And that sounds very strange because nowadays we don't teach medical students to look at the star Sirius and bring it into their calculations about pharmacology. Rather, this goes back to Hippocrates. He was an itinerant physician going from city to city. And he noticed that one time when he went to one city in late August, those are the so-called dog days, because that's when you have the Sirius rising. That's the rising of the dog star. He gave people the usual medicine and the usual dose. He went back to his hotel or his quarters, wherever he was staying. And then the next morning he gets up and everybody's dead. So what does he conclude? Oh, look what the dog star did to my medicine. From now on, I'm going to teach my students never prescribe medicine during the rising of the dog star. Now, he and his students are humane people, and they are moral people, and they don't want to engage in medicine that harms people. Remember the beginning of the Socratic, or rather the beginning of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. So for century after century, generation after generation, doctors schooled in Hippocrates, and then eventually Roman doctors schooled in Galen, and then medievals schooled in both Hippocrates and Galen. And of course, this is true for Islamic medicine as well, tend to repeat the same established verities. Now, the problem is that they don't have a way of winnowing out and separating accidental conjunctures from necessary causes. And so what the addition of the experimental method to science does is allow us to scrape off all the accumulated barnacles of accidental correlation. And so everything had to be tested. And after being tested, it turns out that the dog star doesn't have anything to do with medicine. But remember that Galen and Hippocrates are still being taught at the University of Padua when it begins in the 1200s. So that's a very long time to accumulate a mistake. What the Enlightenment is going to do is saying, we're not taking anything on authority. Everything has to be tested and everything has to be justified by some experimental outcome. So these two things, mathematical formalization and the experimental method, are what characterize the third big iteration of science in the West. And that's the science that begins with Copernicus and Kepler, reaches its high point with Isaac Newton, and then the last big contribution to this, how can I put it, this circuit of science would be Darwin's Origin of Species. Okay. Now, a second thing you have to know is that Descartes is primarily a mathematician. He thinks like a mathematician. And in that respect, he's very comfortable with Plato's demand for absolute certainty. In other words, he wants a perfect starting point, which is certainly true, which no one can possibly doubt. And once he has that 0, 0 point on the Cartesian coordinate, remember, that's the center of a Cartesian graph. He's the one who invented that two-dimensional set of coordinates you learned about in 11th grade. Well, he's looking for the natural 0, 0 point, the still point from which everything radiates out. So he's looking for a proposition that he knows to be true. Connected with this is that Descartes is working in the shadow of Galileo. He saw what happened to Galileo. He does not want to run afoul of the Inquisition, and he is at pains, I think perhaps a little excessively, to say in just about every other paragraph of the Discourse on Method that he's never doubted anything that any church dogma, and he doubts everything else, but never that, not once, not ever. And methinks the gentleman doth protest too much. He's trying to cover his butt, and that's understandable, but it mars the text in a way. I don't think Descartes is atheistic. I think that, like so many very clever, mathematically inclined thinkers, he painted himself into a corner. And unlike Plato, he couldn't find a satisfactory poetic image to release him from being painted into a corner. So we're asked to believe that Descartes has doubted whether there's an external world. Tables and chairs, he doubts whether any of those exist. Maybe there's a demon who prevents him from, who creates these illusions. He has also doubted that he has a body. Now that's an interesting thing to do. Maybe there's a demon that's feeding in false information about your arms and legs. In some ways, what he's asking is, how do we know that we're not living in the matrix? How can we find a way out? And so Descartes does some thinking, and he's going to bring to his thinking some assumptions that he doesn't talk about directly, but are implicit in the discussion, all right? And they're the characteristic assumptions of a mathematician. Let me call this the assumption of non-vacuous contrast. Another way of describing it would be the correlative concepts, all right? For example, true and false are connected in the sense that you can't have absolute true without some reference to what's false. North and south are correlative concepts. You can't just have north without implicitly having south on your compass. Odd and even integers. Yes, if some integers are divisible by 2 without a remainder, there have to be some others that are not divisible by 2 without a remainder. So that's the idea of non-vacuous contrasts. And he's going to assume this for his purposes and never really justify it. Perhaps it is justifiable, but that would take a better mathematician than me. All right. Another thing I want you to think about is that Descartes' Discourse on Method, or the Meditations on First Philosophy, a book from roughly the same time by Descartes, you often see these in courses described as epistemology courses on the foundations of knowledge. Now, here's something very much worth considering. there's no such thing as the foundations of knowledge, because foundations is a metaphor, right? Buildings have foundations. Knowledge does not. And when you take something metaphorical and you treat it as a literal thing, you are very close to creating wholesale nonsense. Let me give you a metaphor. My eye is a window. Well, okay, I can sort of get an idea of what that might mean. But if you then take the idea that my mind is a window and treat it literally, then the next question is, are your eyelashes windowsills? Or is your iris a glass plate? No, it's not, all right? It's a mistake to literalize a metaphor. And if you think that's an unusual mistake to make, ask yourself about toxic anything. Toxic means poisonous, like it literally refers to things like strychnine. It doesn't refer to the whole collection of things that you happen not to like. That's a literalized metaphor. And if you treat that as if it were literally true, you're going to end up generating a whole bunch of stuff on the level of, is my eyelash a windowsill? Okay, so be very careful when you're doing metaphorical thinking and when you're doing literal thinking. Always ask yourself, am I talking about this literally or metaphorically? And have a care and know which one you're doing. Okay, so the foundations of knowledge is an architectural metaphor. All right, and what he wants to get us is towards something that is absolutely certain, that can't be doubted. Now, he outlines the rules of the method he intends to use. The Discourse on Method was actually the introduction to a series of 3 scientific works, and he wanted to talk about the epistemology that connected some of these scientific works together. So the first rule was that he wanted clear and distinct ideas. That's an admirable idea. This is characteristic of every mathematician. They want things as precise and as clear as they can possibly be. The second is a method not attributed to, but borrowed from Aristotle, the idea of analysis. We're going to break things down into their smallest parts. That's what analysis is. And also, we're going to go from the simplest to the most complex ideas. And finally, we're going to do a complete enumeration of whatever it is we're considering. There's one other important rule, and this is the moral rule. And what he says, look, what Descartes says is, look, yes, I've doubted everything. I've doubted the external world. I've doubted my body. I've doubted a whole bunch of stuff, but I never once, not ever, doubted any of the things that got Galileo into trouble. So if the church doesn't like heliocentrism, I don't believe in it. If the church finds anything else that's objectionable, I don't believe in that either. I never suggested it, and I never even thought it. Now, he's at a kind of inflection point in Western culture. Remember that all the Christians were pretty much uncomfortable and in many ways disapproving of the beginnings of modern natural science. And this includes both Protestants and Catholics. Luther didn't like heliocentrism and wrote against it. So did Calvin, so did Zwingli. And when Galileo was condemned by the Inquisition, it wasn't a unanimous condemnation. There were 10 judges and 7 voted to condemn and 3 voted to acquit. So the church couldn't figure out what it was trying to do, but was going to go on the safe side because they had made the mistake of thinking that all new ideas were either Protestant or the concomitants of Protestantism. The church was in lockdown mode due to the emergence of the Protestant Reformation. And what they did was make the awful mistake of allying themselves against science, and everybody lost here. Religion lost, science lost, and the culture of Western Europe lost. So it was a dreadful mistake, and Descartes decided he was not going to make that mistake. He had seen what happened to Galileo. Okay, now, remember, we have correlative concepts here. What Descartes wants is absolute certainty, so he's going to investigate absolute skepticism to see what's left over after he's been skeptical about everything you can possibly doubt. So it's intended to be a kind of mental judo, right? By thinking up the list of everything that can ever be doubted, whatever else is left, remember, there has to be some correlative that's going to be left over, or else everything is dubious, which means nothing is dubious, and the idea of certainty and uncertainty breaks down. Okay, so he looks around and decides that maybe the external world isn't real, maybe his body isn't real, maybe his senses aren't real, even, and this must have been very painful for a mathematician, even mathematics may be wrong. Now think about this, all right? This is something that if Plato had thought it up, I believe would have caused him a great many nightmares. The set of integers is infinitely large. And one of the implications of that is that the set of constructible addition problems is also infinitely large, right? Think about it for a second, you'll see that that's true. Okay, now human life is finite, which means that no one and no group collection of people can do every constructible addition problem. Why? Because there are more of the addition problems than there are moments in human life and human cognitive ability. So here's the mathematician's nightmare. What if all the constructible addition problems can be found to have true answers using the rules of arithmetic, except for one that's way, way out there, you know, some 180 digit number plus some 1,000,007 digit number. Maybe for that it doesn't work. How do we know? We're never going to know empirically, because constructing addition problems and doing them, while perhaps necessary in learning how to add, you're never going to get to the end of that. So who knows? Maybe addition doesn't work at some point. That's just an example of the kind of problem that he has. How do we know that mathematics is true? I mean, we can try and say because we've done it and it works out and it's logically coherent, but Descartes said, no, I can imagine doubting that because, well, we haven't done them all. And not only that, we can't do them all. Now, this is terrible for a rationalist like Descartes. Even mathematics is suspect. What shall we do? Well, Descartes looks within himself and he gazes at his navel and he throws another log on the fire. And then he starts thinking about thinking. And it occurs to him that every thinker or every thought entails a thinker. Let me give this to you in terms of, at least Americans might understand a little better. And if you're not an American, you should still be able to follow along. Think of baseball. There's never pitching without a pitcher. I mean, pitching doesn't happen on its own. Similarly, there's no batting without a batter. You have to have some guy at the plate with a piece of wood in his hand. Batting never happens on its own. Same sort of thing with catching. The ball never gets caught unless there's somebody with a glove on catching the ball. So every action requires an actor, which is a way of saying that every predicate requires a subject. That would be the way of phrasing it in grammatical terms. So there are lots of ways of talking about the same thing. Now, Descartes says, you know what? I'm thinking. And the kind of thinking I'm doing is an absolute skepticism. And I doubted my body, and I doubted the material world, and I doubted math and everything. But there has to be a me doing the doubting, because doubt, like pitching and catching and batting, doesn't happen on its own. There has to be a doubter. That's me. So Descartes is now convinced that he is. That's an admirable achievement. So he's found his 0, point. Now, the next question is, once Descartes knows that he is, the implicit question that comes next is, what are you? And Descartes says, well, I just learned something, and I'm absolutely sure of it. So what that means is that I have certain properties that attach to me by virtue of the fact that I can't doubt that I am. So first of all, this involves the idea that Descartes is finite, all right, because he doesn't know everything. Second, that he's fallible. The reason why he knows he's fallible is because prior to doing this thought experiment, he didn't know what the answer was to the question, what can't be doubted? But now he does. So he must have been mistaken before. And in addition to that, he is also imperfect. Why? Because being ignorant and fallible and finite are imperfections. So Descartes is finite, is imperfect, and is fallible. Now, watch this. It's a beautiful little move. And once you see it, you can't help but stand back and admire. If Descartes is certain that he is, and that generates an equal certainty that he is finite, imperfect, and fallible, that means that there's something that is infinite, perfect, and infallible. And that's, you know who? God. So now Descartes has done a very strange thing, very different from what the Western religious and intellectual tradition had been used to. Instead of deriving man from God, he derived God from himself. All right. And because he's certain that he exists, he is equally certain, in a mathematical, logical sense of entailment, that he's finite, imperfect, and fallible. And that means that there's a being, because you need these are correlative concepts. You need the idea of non-vacuous concepts. There must equally be certain the existence of an infinite, perfect, infallible being, and that's God himself. Okay, now that we know that God exists and that he's infinite, perfect, and infallible, ask yourself, would a perfect being tell lies? No, that's an imperfection of thought and speech and also intent. And since God created math, that's our guarantee that mathematics works. We don't need to do all the addition problems in the world. All we need to know is that God exists and that a perfect, infinite, infallible God would not tell lies. What has he got to dissemble about? And that means we can be sure of mathematics all the way everywhere. What's logically true is logically true because it stems from the mind of God, who never tells lies. Sweet. Now we have all of mathematics vouched for. Now, Descartes says something very important here. He says, recently, some thinkers, and he's thinking of Galileo, but he's also thinking of himself. Some thinkers have successfully mathematized our understanding of the physical world. For example, Galileo was the first one to show that a baseball or a football or a soccer ball, if it's thrown, will describe the path called a parabola, right? And that's mathematically describable. So the point then is that God guarantees math, and mathematizing, creating mathematical formalizations for physics, that guarantees that our new physics is correct. And now we can have absolute knowledge about the physical world. And then this is perhaps unique to Descartes. He even goes so far as to say, if a mathematician were to have a dream about a mathematical proof, when he wakes up, writes the proof down, looks it over and finds that the proof is accurate, that it's a genuine proof, that means that even dreams can be real. Ah, thank God for mathematics. Here's the chart of it. I don't know if you folks can see it, but it runs down here. We get God, we get math, we get physics, and we get dreams. Now, where have we seen this before? I'll give you a moment. Okay, this is Plato's divided line from Book 6 of the Republic. God is the form of the good, then we get math, and then for Plato, we get the divided line right there, then we get the physical world, and then we get imitations. What has happened in modern natural science is that we've taken Plato's divided line and dropped it a level. We mathematized our physics. So now he wants to retort to Plato, yes, you can know about the physical world because we've mathematized it, and God is the great guarantee, is the great insurance policy in the sky for our mathematics. Right? So Plato's lust for absolute certainty is revived in Descartes, and he thinks he's cracked the cosmic egg. This is the final knowledge that we're going to need for all other constructible knowledge. That's an amazing thing to do. And you have to admire him. I mean, he's something like an intellectual mountain climber. And I admire his bravado. I'm not sure of his answers. I think that they are often wrong. But like Plato, he asks very high-level questions, and that's an important element in assessing the importance of any thinker. Okay, now he says at the beginning of his meditation here, and remember that he's writing in French rather than Latin because he's writing for a general literate audience, not just for other scholars. So what he writes is, let me show it to you here. Yeah. Je pense donc je suis, I think therefore I am. And it works in other languages too. Like English, I think therefore I am. Also, like as in Latin, cogito ergo sum. What do these have in common? They all carry with them the meaning is, I think, consequently, I am. Okay. So what Descartes thinks is that he's discovered the ultimate structure of reality. It all proceeds from the fact that we're thinking and we can't possibly doubt that there's somebody doing the thinking. And since there's you, that means that we can find out certain predicates to attach to you. And then from there, we can bootstrap ourselves with equal logical certainty to God. And God will serve to justify our faith in math. And math, extended into the physical world, will allow us to know even that. So the domain of space and time, which Plato disdained, and which Aristotle said, well, you can have rough and ready practical knowledge of this. Descartes is saying you're both wrong. Plato, you're wrong in thinking you can't know about the external world of the senses. Aristotle, you're wrong in thinking that it's just a practical knowledge. Once you mathematize physics, it's no longer practical. It's then an exact science with exactly the same logical force that any other purely logical system has. Wow. So he's hunting intellectual big game here. Now, there are problems with this, all right? He's right that thinking implies a thinker, but he's wrong in thinking that that's the structure of reality. In fact, he hasn't discovered the structure of reality. What Descartes has discovered is the structure of French. All right, here's the idea, all right? What he's discerned is that every predicate requires a subject, and that in the grammar of the French or English or Latin languages, we connect predicates to subjects using a copulative verb called to be. In German, it's sein, in French, it's être, but we have a predicate and we have a subject, and we have to connect them with some be verb in order to have a complete sentence. Such is the grammar of, well, all those languages derived from Indo-European sources. Now, it's also going to be true that the same grammatical structures are found in ancient Greek. For that matter, they're even found in Sanskrit. Descartes thinks that that's because these languages are taking into account the logical structure of the world. That's not the case. What they're really doing is all repeating the same grammar that was derived from the same parent language. It is perfectly possible to have a language, and there are languages that just don't have any verb that corresponds to being. Let me give you an example from popular culture that I assume you all know. You know Tarzan, you know, the jungle guy that swings from tree to tree using vines? Well, he's never been to grammar school, so he doesn't use what would be thought of as proper English grammar. Instead, he says, me Tarzan. And then he points over to Jane and he says, her Jane. And then he points over to his pet monkey and says, him Cheetah. Now, proper English grammar would require, I am Tarzan, she is Jane, he is Cheetah. But think about this. He doesn't bother with the use of the copulative verb to be, because it doesn't add anything to the cognitive content of what he's saying. I understand perfectly well what he means when he says, me Tarzan, her Jane. And what that leaves us with is the idea that being, rather than some weird, spooky ontological thing that causes people to, as Heidegger does, investigate being, they think they're investigating some Urstoff, some ultimate thing. I believe what they're investigating is the grammatical rule for copulative verbs. As Wittgenstein once said, and it's a beautiful line, metaphysics is the shadow cast upon our understanding by grammar. Okay, imagine if Tarzan had done Descartes' experiment. He said, me Tarzan, but he's not going to be able to find out that Tarzan is, since me Tarzan, that's all you get. The same thing for all the other business. Being is a placeholder that connects, at the very least, it's a placeholder that connects subjects and predicates. Okay. What he's done then is found out that all the languages he knows, which would be like French and Greek and Latin, that they all have a common grammar. He thinks that gestures at a common reality. But in fact, what it does is gesture at a common history. They're all derived from the Indo-European languages from 5,000 years earlier. That's why not only do they have a common grammar, but they often have a common vocabulary as well. All right. So Descartes, I think, has fooled himself. I'm not sure. I think Kierkegaard is going to take a big chunk out of Descartes when he says, look, everybody starts somewhere. There's no 0, 0 still point. And that means that Descartes' search for absolute certainty is a futile search. It's an attempt to square the circle, and it can't possibly work. So I admire Descartes' ambition. I am not convinced by his argument. Now, final thing, Cartesian dualism. Towards the end of the work, he brings in what seems like an extraneous issue, sheep hearts. He said recently, biologists have discovered that the heart of a sheep does not do the sheep's thinking. In fact, it doesn't have any function apart from pumping blood. It's a kind of a pump. It's a mechanism. And he says not only is a sheep's heart mechanical, but the liver and the lungs and the eyes and all the parts of a sheep are in fact mechanical, because the whole sheep is a big woolly machine. All right. So living things are mechanisms. They're complex biochemical mechanisms, but mechanisms nonetheless. Now, of course, he's painted himself into a corner, because what he needs is some way of distinguishing between mechanical sheep and more than mechanical people. And he does by referring back to language again. What he does is this. He says, look, parrots and minor birds like that, can be taught to speak, but they can only be taught to repeat sentences they've already heard. But human beings are a combination of mind and matter. In other words, there's a kind of ghost that inhabits the mechanism of your body. And this non-physical, non-material property carries with it freedom and rationality. In other words, you participate in the logos, which means that you can construct new sentences that you've never heard before, like I think, therefore I am, right? Descartes didn't need some animal to teach him that. He worked that out on his own. And he says that's the quality that separates mechanical sheep and mechanical lions from non-mechanical people. The human body is mechanical, and that has to be the case. Otherwise, you couldn't have a science of medicine. But the human mind is separate and different. Now, the difficulty that's going to emerge here is that this creates at least as many, probably more problems than it solves. Because now the question is how this spooky, ghost-like, spiritual, woo kind of stuff, how it slips inside your body. And there's a funny story about that. Anatomy was being done with great zeal and great curiosity in Descartes' time. It became quite commonplace. And they were still holding on to the old Aristotelian idea of organization and natural teleology. In other words, every part of the body is supposed to have some natural function, a telos. And the anatomists had done a pretty good job of attributing digestion to the gut and sight to the eyes and pumping blood to the heart. But they stumbled upon a new thing, which previously hadn't been noticed. It was called the hypothalamus. It's a little gland back there. It's at the bottom of the base of your skull. It's now part of the endocrine system as it's understood. But back then, they couldn't figure out what this little pea-shaped thing or pea-sized thing is at the back of your head. Well, somebody started reading Descartes, and another person, or perhaps the same person, was doing anatomy, and he said, boom, 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 this is the answer. The hypothalamus serves the function of allowing your soul, your mind, the free part of you, access like through a keyhole. That's how it comes into to create the meat. So when you move your arm up and down, that's a mechanical action of your arms, but it's caused by that free will that you have that comes in from the great beyond. And its access point is your hypothalamus. Now, this is probably the dumbest idea of the 17th century, all right? But it shows you how desperate they are to find a way to hold on to natural teleology, the organization of the body, and find some solution to how the meat somehow takes in this stuff that isn't meat and turns it from determinate to free. Now, we've given up on that account of the hypothalamus, thank God. But for all of you that want to be a composite of mind and matter, you owe everybody an explanation for how that works and how the spooky stuff moves the meat around. For those of you that want to abolish this dualism and go with a monism, you owe us all an explanation for how I got the illusion that I was capable of choosing whether to move my hand or not. Because no matter how clever your description of the biochemistry is, my direct experience suggests to me that I'm choosing to do it. And if you're going to say, well, then your experience is wrong, have a care. Here's why. All right. Do we judge our theories on the basis of our experience, or do we judge our experience on the basis of our theories? Let me grant that you have an admirable mechanistic account of the biochemistry of the body. When I say, well, my experience of the world is that I'm making choices and decisions, and that I had the decision what shirt to put on today and what to say in my Descartes lecture, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to abandon my experience in favor of your theory, or maybe suggest that you modify your theory so that it's consistent with my experience, because I'm not the only one experiencing this. Those of you at home who are listening to this, do this. Now, you chose whether to obey my order or not. That's the problem right there. Nobody knows how to join the internal world, what I'll call the intracosm, with the external world. I'll call that the exocosm. We have a world within us. We have a world external to us. The natural sciences do an admirable job of describing and explaining the external world. As they try and break in, they can go further and further, but how detailed an anatomy of the human brain are you going to need to do before you find the experience of freedom? This is what Chalmers calls the explanatory gap between our internal experience and our natural science, our account of the external world. We would like them to join hands and shake hands and have one big unified science. The problem is that the intercosm or the intracosm, the world within, it's very hard to make a connection